The sun hung low over the sprawling Montana plains, casting golden streaks across the Lazy H Ranch, where cattle load and dust swirled in the evening breeze. Clayton Harrow, the richest rancher in 3 counties, leaned against his polished pickup truck, his Stetson tilted back, a smirk playing on his lips. He just returned from the high country, where the air was thin and the folks were tougher than the granite peaks. The townsfolk of Bitterroot Valley whispered about his latest stunt of bringing home a woman from the mountains, a wild, unkempt creature named Leela Stone. They called her the Mountain Woman, a recluse who lived in a ramshackle cabin, hunting and foraging, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. Clayton had met her at a trading post, her hair a tangle of black, her hands calloused, her voice rough as gravel. He'd invited her to the ranch on a whim, a cruel jest to shock his high society friends at the annual gala. Let's see how they handle a real wildcat, he'd chuckled to his foreman, Jed. The townsfolk buzzed with gossip of Clayton, with his tailored suits and oil money swagger, parading a feral woman for laughs. Leela arrived in a borrowed dress, too big for her wiry frame, her boots caked with mud. She stood in the grand foyer of Clayton's mansion, her gaze darting like a cornered animal's. The maids tittered behind their hands, and Jed shook his head, muttering, "This ain't right, boss." But Clayton, sipping whiskey, saw only the prank, not the storm brewing in Leela's eyes. She spoke little, her words clipped, but when she did, her voice carried the weight of the mountains. At the gala, the guests draped in silks and diamonds agog as Leela entered, her presence a stark contrast to their polished world. Clayton raised the glass, his voice booming, to new friends. The crowd laughed, thinking her a spectacle. Leela's lips twitched, not in a smile, but something sharper. She leaned close to Clayton, her breath warm against his ear, and whispered something no one else heard. His face paled, the glass trembling in his hand. The room hushed, sensing a shift, but Leela only stepped back, her eyes glinting with secrets older than the hills. The gala continued, chandeliers glittering above the oak-paneled ballroom, but Clayton's charm faltered. His laugh, usually bold, rang hollow, and his eyes kept darting to Leela, who stood by the fireplace, her borrowed dress slipping off one shoulder. The guests, oblivious, swirled in their dances, their voices a hum of gossip about the savage in their midst. Leela held a glass of wine she didn't drink, her fingers tracing the rim, her gaze fixed on the flames. Clayton's sister, Margaret, approached her, her smile tight. "So, Miss Stone, what brings you to civilization?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Leela's eyes flicked up, sharp and unyielding. "Ain't here for your world," she said softly, "but I reckon I'll stay a spell." The guests nearby chuckled, thinking her quaint, but Clayton, across the room, stiffened. He hadn't told anyone what she whispered, but it gnawed at him. He'd expected a backward hermit, someone to parade for amusement, but Leela was no fool. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, her silence louder than their chatter. Jed, watching from the doorway, noticed how the ranch hands avoided her, whispering about her uncanny knack for tracking game in the high country. "She ain't just wild," Jed muttered to a stable boy. "She's something else." As the night wore on, Clayton tried to regain his swagger, clapping backs and pouring drinks, but Leela's presence was a splinter under his skin. She didn't belong, yet she commanded the room without trying. When a rancher's wife asked Leela about her life in the mountains, Leela's answer was simple: "You live with what's real up there. Down here, yeah, I'll hide from it." The room laughed, thinking her naive, but Clayton's jaw tightened. He remembered her whisper words that cut deeper than any blade. By midnight, the guests were drunk on wine and their own self-importance, but Leela slipped outside, her silhouette stark against the moonlit plains. Clayton followed, his boots heavy on the porch. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice low. Leela turned, her eyes catching the starlight, and said nothing, but her silence spoke of truths he wasn't ready to face. The next morning, the ranch woke to a restless energy. The hands went about their chores amending fences, herding cattle, but their eyes kept straying to the guest quarters where Leela stayed. Clayton, nursing a hangover and a growing unease, avoided her. He'd planned to send her back to the mountains after the gala, a tidy end to his joke, but her whisper lingered, a riddle he couldn't shake. In the kitchen, the cook, Maria, muttered prayers as she kneaded dough, claiming Leela's shadow felt wrong. Jed, ever practical, told her to hush, but even he watched Leela warily as she emerged, her borrowed dress swapped for a flannel shirt and jeans from the bunkhouse. She moved with purpose, helping a hand fix a broken gate, her hands deft and sure. The men stared, unsure whether to mock or admire her. Clayton, from his study window, watched too, his coffee growing cold. He'd heard stories of mountain folk and recluses who knew the land's secrets, who spoke to the wind, but he dismissed them as folklore. Now, doubt crept in. Leela's whisper had been no threat, no plea, but something else, something that made his wealth and power feel small. By noon, Margaret cornered him, her voice sharp. "Send her back, Clayton. She's making a fool of us all." But Clayton, staring at the horizon, didn't answer. Leela, meanwhile, wandered the ranch, her boots leaving faint prints in the dust. She paused by the corral, watching a stallion buck, and when it charged, she didn't flinch. Instead, she clicked her tongue, and the beast calmed, nuzzling her hand. The hands gasped, and Jed crossed himself, muttering, "Ain't natural." That evening, Clayton found her by the creek, skipping stones with a precision that spoke of years alone. "Why'd you come?" he asked, his voice softer now. Leela didn't look up. "You asked," she said, "but you didn't know what you was a-skin for." Her words carried the weight of her whisper, and Clayton's chest tightened. He wanted to demand answers, to reclaim control, but her presence unraveled him. As the sun dipped below the mountains, Leela turned, her eyes locking with his, and he knew she saw through his bravado to the hollow man beneath. 4 days passed, and Leela became a fixture on the ranch. Though she remained an enigma, the hands grew used to her, some even seeking her advice on tracking or fixing tools, her knowledge of the land surpassing their own. Clayton, however, grew restless. His prank had backfired. Leela wasn't the joke he was. The townsfolk still gossiped, but now they spoke of her strength, her quiet authority, and Clayton's folly in thinking he could tame her. Margaret, furious at the shift, demanded Leela's departure, but Clayton hesitated. Her whisper haunted him, a secret he couldn't share, not even with Jed, who'd begun to respect Leela's grit. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, dark clouds piling over the peaks. The cattle spooked, breaking a fence and scattering toward the hills. The hands scrambled, but Leela took charge, her voice cutting through the wind as she directed them to the high ground. Clayton watched, rain soaking his hat, as she rode a borrowed mare with a grace he hadn't expected. By dusk, the herd was safe, and the hands cheered her, their laughter warm for the first time. Clayton, soaked and shivering, approached her as she brushed down the mare. "You're no ordinary woman," he said, half accusing. Leela's eyes met his, unyielding. "Ain't trying to be," she replied. That night, by the fire in the main house, Clayton pressed her again about the whisper. "What did you mean?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. Leela stirred the coals, her face unreadable. "You'll know when you're ready," she said, and the words felt like a challenge. The ranch hands, gathered in the bunkhouse, began to spin tales about how she'd once faced down a bear, how she knew the old ways of the land. Jed, skeptical but intrigued, shared a story he'd heard at the trading post. Leela's family had lived in the mountains for generations, keepers of secrets tied to the earth itself. Clayton dismissed it as nonsense, but doubt gnawed at him. Leela's presence was changing the ranch, softening its edges, exposing its flaws. He caught himself watching her, not as a joke, but as a mystery he needed to solve. And still, her whisper echoed, a truth he couldn't yet grasp. A week later, the ranch faced a crisis. A neighboring rancher, Tom Bragg, claimed Clayton's cattle had strayed onto his land, trampling crops. He demanded payment, his voice loud at the town meeting, his eyes gleaming with old grudges. Clayton, used to buying his way out of trouble, offered cash, but Bragg wanted more land, influence, a piece of the lazy age. The townsfolk watched, eager for drama, and Clayton felt the weight of their judgment. Leela, who'd slipped into the meeting unnoticed, stood at the back, her arms crossed. When Bragg accused Clayton of arrogance, Leela stepped forward, her voice steady. "Land don't belong to you or him," she said, her eyes on Bragg. It belongs to itself. The room fell silent, her words carrying an authority no one expected. Bragg laughed, but it was nervous, and he backed down, muttering about settling later. Clayton, stunned, thanked her afterward, but Leela only shrugged. "Ain't about you," she said, and walked away. That night, Clayton found her by the barn, staring at the stars. He pressed her again about the whisper, his frustration spilling over. "Why won't you tell me?" he demanded. Leela turned, her face softened by moonlight. "Because you ain't listening," she said. Her words stung, and Clayton realized he'd been blind to her strength, her wisdom, seeing only his own game. The ranch hands, now loyal to Leela, began to share more stories of how she'd helped a lost child find his way home, how she'd predicted a storm before the clouds appeared. Jed, warming to her, admitted to Clayton, "She's got something we don't. Maybe it's time you stopped playing the fool." Clayton bristled but couldn't argue. Leela was no longer the outsider he was. Her whisper, whatever it was, held the truth about him, about the ranch, about the life he'd built on pride and wealth. As the days passed, Clayton noticed change as the hands worked harder, the ranch felt alive, and even Margaret softened, asking Leela about medicinal herbs. But the whisper remained a locked door, and Clayton, for the first time, wondered if he was worthy of its key. 6. The turning point came on a crisp morning when a fire broke out in the north pasture. A lightning strike from a rogue storm set the dry grass ablaze, threatening the herd and the ranch's heart. The hands scrambled, Clayton shouting orders, but panic spread faster than the flames. Leela, calm as stone, grabbed a shovel and rallied the men, her voice cutting through the chaos. She knew the land's contours, directing them to dig a firebreak where the blaze would falter. Clayton, sweating and soot-streaked, worked beside her, his pride forgotten. By nightfall, the fire was out, the ranch saved, and the hands looked to Leela with awe. Clayton, exhausted, found her by the creek, washing ash from her hands. "You saved us," he said, his voice raw. Leela didn't look up. "Ain't about saving you," she said. "It's about what's right." Her words echoed her whisper, and Clayton felt closer to understanding, though the meaning still slipped through his fingers. The townsfolk, hearing of the fire, arrived with supplies, their gossip now tinged with respect for Leela. Even Bragg sent a grudging nod, his feud quieted. That night, around a bonfire, the hands shared stories, and Leela, for the first time, spoke of the mountain sun not as a recluse, but as a guardian of its secrets. She told of streams that sang, of winds that carried warnings, of a world alive in ways the valley forgot. Clayton listened, his heart heavy with regret. He'd brought her here to mock, but she'd exposed his shallowness, his need for control. Jed, sitting nearby, leaned in. "She's teaching us something, boss. Question is, you learnin'?" Clayton didn't answer, but as Leela's eyes met his across the fire, he felt her whispers weight again. It wasn't just words, it was a mirror, reflecting his flaws, his fears, his chance to change. He approached her later, his voice quiet. "I'm sorry," he said, the first honest words he'd spoken in years. Leela nodded, her gaze steady. "That's a start," she said, and walked into the night, leaving him to wrestle with the truth she'd planted. 7. By the time autumn painted the plains in reds and golds, Leela had become the ranch's heartbeat. The hands sought her wisdom, from curing sick calves to reading the weather, and even Margaret, once scornful, asked her to teach her about the land. Clayton, humbled, began to see the ranch through Leela's eyes, and not as a trophy, but as a living thing, tied to the mountains she called home. He stopped wearing his tailored suits, trading them for work shirts, his hands blistered from honest labor. The townsfolk noticed the change, their gossip softening into curiosity. Leela, though, remained a mystery, her past a tapestry of half-told stories. Some said she'd lost a family to the mountains, others that she was born of the wild itself. Clayton no longer cared about the rumors, he wanted her truth. One evening, as they walked the fence line, he asked about her whisper again, his voice gentle. "I'm ready now," he said. Leela stopped, her eyes searching his, as if weighing his soul. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded, and she leaned close, her voice low, her breath warm. The words she spoke were simple, yet they struck him like thunder. unraveling years of pride and blindness. He staggered back, his eyes wide, seeing her now not as a joke, but as a force, a teacher, a mirror to his own buried heart. He wouldn't share her words, not with Jed, not with anyone, for they were his to carry. The next day, Leela packed her few belongings, her time at the ranch complete. The hands gathered, their faces heavy with gratitude, and even Margaret shed a tear. Clayton, standing by the gate, tried to speak, but words failed him. Leela touched his arm, her touch steady. "Keep listening," she said, and turned toward the mountains. As she walked away, her figure small against the vast peaks, Clayton felt the ranch breathe differently, alive, awake, changed. Her whisper, now his secret, was a promise to live better, to honor the land and its truths. 8 months later, the Lazy H Ranch thrived, its rhythm steadier, its people humbler. Clayton, no longer the brash rancher, worked alongside his hands, his laughter genuine, his heart open. The townsfolk spoke of Leela as a legend, the mountain woman who'd tamed a rich man's pride without raising her voice. Clayton never shared her whisper, but it guided him, a compass for a life remade. He sold off half his land, giving it to a trust for the mountain's protection, a nod to Leela's teachings. Jed, now his closest friend, often asked what she'd said, but Clayton only smiled, saying, "It's enough to know it changed me." The ranch hands told stories of how she'd walked into the wild and vanished, how the wind seemed to carry her voice on quiet nights. Margaret, now tending a garden with herbs Leela taught her, claimed the mountains glowed brighter since her departure. One evening, as Clayton sat on the porch, a letter arrived, its envelope worn, its postmark from a town deep in the high country. Inside was a single line in Leela's scrawl, "The land remembers." Clayton read it, his eyes stinging, and looked to the peaks where she'd gone. He understood now her whisper wasn't just for him, but for all who'd forgotten the earth's pulse. He folded the letter, tucking it into his shirt, and walked to the creek, where he'd first seen her strength. The water sang, and he listened, hearing her in its flow. The ranch, the valley, the mountains, they were one, and Leela had shown him how to see it. As the stars emerged, Clayton whispered his own promise to the night, vowing to live as she taught him, with respect, with truth, with the heart open to the wild. And somewhere, in the high country, Leela Stone, the mountain woman, smiled, her secrets safe with the wind.